This particular talk, this is track 7. The nice thing is this one's not split into half like some of the other tracks. This is track 7. We get all of 360, so good. Today's track is going to be by Michael Leland, the Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist for SentinelOne, balancing AI with the indispensable human element in cybersecurity. Michael joined SentinelOne in 2021, bringing over 25 years of security expertise. He's responsible for thought leadership, messaging, and product development, and has held senior positions at various companies, including McAfee and Avaya. He also teaches cybersecurity courses at several universities. And with that, I will hand it off to you, sir.
Excellent, thank you. I don't know which is the worst session to have, the one right after lunch or the one right before drinks. But hopefully everyone stays awake today. Thank you for attending. As mentioned, my name is Michael Leland, Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist. Other people with my role call themselves futurists. I don't like that term. You have to be right far too often. So no crystal ball. But I'll give you some perspectives. How many of you have sat through at least 3 or more AI sessions this week? Yeah. So yet one more. Thank you for picking one more AI session. Little of my history, I was co-founder and CTO of a company called Nitro Security before we got acquired by McAfee in 2011, before they destroyed my product in 2019. But my goal there was obviously, building security operations for practitioners. And I think the important thing about AI is how we look at using AI to be a force multiplier to the human intellectual capital that is so hard to get and retain. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of some philosophies. I'm not selling anything. I am just trying to raise awareness. My role is a thought leadership one, so I'm looking forward to the questions as much as delivering the content. So if you think about it, this session talks about kind of the big question that everyone has, and that is, will AI replace the roles that we have right now? And one thing you'll notice is these are not headlines taken off of recent presses. Look at that, Stephen Hawking is listed there. This was something that was talked about as much as a decade ago, but a decade ago we were talking about it in terms of RPA, which is remote process automation, robotic process automation rather. But it's always been a conversation point is, will automation and the acceleration of and adoption of AI replace the jobs that we hold so dear? Now, that might be a misnomer. We may not hold these jobs very dear. If you're a tier 1 SOC analyst looking at logs all day, you probably hate your life and go home miserable. So we have to look at the ways that we can actually leverage AI and machine learning to be force multipliers. But here's the thing. AI is not new, right? This is not something that's brand new to the industry. What we're hearing about a lot these days is generative AI. But vendors like SentinelOne and probably most of the vendors out there who are doing detection have been using machine learning for years, probably 10 or more years, but that was on the detection side. That was looking at behavioral analytics, the understanding of what's happening on an endpoint or in a cloud workload, and trying to determine if the behaviors are suspicious enough to be escalated to the status of malicious. So it's benign until it gets convicted to a disposition, and then you have to automate or at least have playbooks for response actions. So we're going to talk a little bit about where AI will play a role in those. So the question, will robots replace us? Probably not. More likely, we should expect to see humans and machines working better together, right? This is a mutual trust between us and the AI. Trusting AI is a difficult concept these days. We'll talk about hallucinations a little bit later and things like that, but this is the goal. So let's talk a little bit about it from the perspective of cybersecurity and the challenges facing security operations practitioners. The first of which, we hear this all the time, right? The attack surface is rapidly growing, and we'll talk about some statistics in a minute. That's probably a no-brainer. I don't need to go into too much detail about that. The attack surface is growing for any number of reasons. The expansion of SaaS, the adoption of cloud, like all of these things are creating tremendous amount of risk because of the attack surface they're presenting to an adversary. We know that it's also difficult when you start incorporating multiple techs from different vendors into your stack, right? How many of you were at RSA this year? Okay, so at RSA this year in San Fran, there were 640 vendors. And I did the math. 300 of them weren't there last year, and I'd be willing to bet 300 of them won't be here next year. But I also did the math, and 220 of them had plastered AI somewhere on their branding at their booth. Whether they were using it for any means of intellectual intelligence or not, they were talking about themselves in terms of AI. In fact, if you look at the way most vendors are using AI, it's a text box where you put a prompt in, and that prompt is simply proxying it over to an OpenAI or a Gemini, and then regurgitating the results back in. It's not curating anything for you. It's just simply providing you a window into somebody else's AI, and it's not doing any curation or validation to prevent and eliminate hallucination. So we've got to be careful with what we expect from vendors in this space, but we're going to see a lot more of that. And when you start adding multiple vendors, you're going to have competing AI. In fact, even vendors, or customers rather, that have exclusions in their organization for utilizing AI, what happened with Shadow IT, they found other ways around the enforcement mechanisms you had. So Shadow AI is a huge thing now, either because your customers or employees are going to find a way to use it anyway, or you're going to be utilizing a tool like Salesforce or something else that just kind of throws it in their next release that you didn't know about, and all of a sudden AI is being exposed to your customers. So be careful of that. We also know that if we continue to do manual efforts for triage, investigations, threat hunting, we just can't keep pace. For one, adversaries are already leveraging AI against us, so we know that the speed and accuracy of these guys is improving dramatically. There was a 400% improvement in successful business email compromises last year. 400%. Anybody know why it improved so much? Because phishing emails look a lot more legitimate now, right? They're written correctly, the grammar is correct, there's not a whole lot of spelling mistakes, but most of them also still start with the term, "I hope this message finds you well." So be careful, look for that and exclude those immediately. But if we continue doing things manually, we're never going to keep pace with the rapid adoption of AI by the adversaries, so we've got to keep pace at the same scale. Skill shortage. We have a whole slide on this, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this bullet. We're going to go into this one in a minute, but how many of you have a completely, fully staffed security operations organization, no open headcount, not worried about attrition, your people are properly trained and certified and doing exactly what they should do, and no one's going to leave because they want a better job somewhere else? Anybody have open headcount? No one raises their hand? Yeah, okay. We'll talk about that in a minute. And kind of like the middle one, if we're manual, we're slow, we need to be a lot more proactive in our response and automation. We have to make sure that it's presented to an analyst only when it's an actionable information result, something that they can actually work on. Who's seen the pyramid of pain? That analogy that says, the easy ones are things like domain and IP blocking, the hard ones are like TTPs. The other way to look at that is you've got a massive amount of data. We're going to talk about that too. Data has to be resolved down to information. Information becomes knowledge, and knowledge becomes wisdom and insight. That's the other pyramid that we look at, and the massive amount of data is a huge problem, and it doesn't allow us to be reactive, doesn't allow us to be proactive, so we got to be careful with that as well. Who recognizes this by a show of hands? A few of you. If you said stereo equalizer, you get credit. If you said hi-fi equalizer, I also know how old you are. This device was used in our rack of stereo equipment years ago to customize the tonal quality of the music you're listening to. And for those of you who remember this, you also know that every one of these 64 little knobs, dials, buttons, they needed to be customized for the persona of music you were listening to. So if you were listening to jazz, it had one set of parameters. If you were listening to opera, it was completely different. Rock and roll, you'd have to reconfigure it. How many people think we got this right every time? I would argue we probably got it right very few times. And then what do? We set it one way and left it and never looked back. I say this for the point to make that complexity is the enemy of cybersecurity. The more requirements we have for you to know exactly how to customize and tune for the persona of user or application, we are bound to get it wrong. And this is kind of in three separate areas. We'll talk about the complexity of data. First of all, we're generating far more data now than we ever have in the past. Most of it, by the way, about 80% is machine to machine. That's a very different format and structure than user to machine. So that data has to be treated separately. Sometimes it's unstructured. Sometimes it can't be easily extracted with name value pairs because it's not in JSON. Any number of reasons why it becomes hard. We also know that we're keeping data in separate silos. And the reason I mentioned the fact that I worked for a company that built a SIEM is we had this common problem. There were two ways to onboard or deploy SIEM. One, you would onboard all your data sources. You'd throw all your data in one place, and that data lake quickly became a data swamp. And then you try to figure out what to do with that data later. That never worked. And it became incredibly cost prohibitive because there were certain logs that are so high in volume and low in value, the signal to noise ratio is way, way too high, right? Cloud logs represent one of those difficult challenges, WMI logs from Windows. Even EDR telemetry, which I would argue is the highest fidelity and actionable information, generates so much volume that most organizations couldn't cost justify the ingestion into their SIEM. So that became a problem. And then we're also expecting our practitioners to become proficient, let alone expert, in multiple query languages, whether it's S1QL, which is ours, or Splunk query language, or Microsoft SQL, or KQL. Any number of reasons why you're expected to learn and understand multiple query languages to get the right answer. That doesn't scale. Infrastructure has expanded dramatically, from IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS to the proliferation of applications. But the bottom one is interesting, and that is, 10 years ago, we tried solving the BYOD problem. What happens when I have a user machine that came in from home, like their iPad or laptop, and they wanted to connect it to the corporate network? That was a BYOD problem. 5 years ago, in 2020, we had the exact opposite. How do you now take a corporate device, bring it home to an unprotected LAN where the enterprise has no idea what number of IoT devices are out there? We don't know what version your Nest thermostats are running. We don't know if you've bought something from Alibaba that has weird firmware that's talking on your home network. How do you protect that corporate asset with the same level of efficacy that you needed to in the enterprise? That was a problem we had to solve, and many of us did, with things like Zero Trust and VPNs and things like that. That was a simple way to do it, but it presented a huge attack surface that we weren't ready for until that happened. And this is the one I like to talk about, the configuration. How many of you know how many different configuration parameters there are in a brand new AWS EC2 instance related to policy, privilege, and accessibility? Throw out a number. I'll throw one out. There are 7,100 different configuration buttons. Things you could tune, configure, override, inherit from hierarchical policies. 7,100. You think, okay, don't worry about that. I'm in Azure. 5,400. I'm GCP. 3,800. So when I showed that picture of the equalizer, think about that times 1,000, right? All of those things. Only 3% of those are required and relevant to most business user applications, but yet we are stuck playing with the other 97% because we think we need to, and we probably don't. And it's that 97% that is either a default configuration that's risky or over-permissive, or we're making wrong decisions on the configuration and policy of that IAM to begin with, but it creates a huge attack surface for adversaries. The other number I'll give you, 75 seconds. That is the amount of time between you standing up a brand new instance in the cloud and an attacker scanning it. 75 seconds. So we know that if we're leaving things misconfigured or overly permissive in the cloud, it's quickly going to be found and more quickly exploited than we ever thought possible. So when I was selling SIEM, we promised everyone a single pane of glass. How many of you have had a vendor or vendors promise you a single pane of glass? I'm guilty of it. A SIEM was meant to be that single console for everything. And I'm here to say that I apologize that we were selling you this pipe dream. Most people, when they heard that term, single pane of glass, the first thing they thought was like Minority Report, right? They're sitting there aiming at one screen and all the data is just in their face and they take this stuff and I don't need to throw it away and it just comes at you. That's what they envisioned. I actually hate watching procedural crime dramas because the detective shows up, there's a dead body laying on the ground, and what's the first thing they say? I want the film footage from that ATM machine for the last 6 hours, I want his credit card transactions for the last 2 weeks, and every travel receipt he's made in the last 2 years. And somehow the data's there like that? Like that is such an unrealistic expectation, but you know what, in a 30-minute episodic, that's what you have to do. But that's what we expect. That's the kind of visibility we actually need our security operations practitioners to have if we want them to be effective at their job, to have the most visibility to perform triage, root cause analysis, threat hunting, investigations. They need access to as much data as possible, and that data needs to be available to them as quickly as it can and without delay. So while we promised you as an industry a single pane of glass, I like to argue that we've been delivering you a single glass of pain. 8 different consoles, pivoting back and forth between the two of them. I actually think the bane of a SOC analyst's existence is Control-C, Control-V. I go to this console, I search for something, I highlight it, I copy, I spin over to this one, I paste it, I do something else in this console, I take the results from that query, I go to console C, or maybe back to console A. We did a study when I was at Intel several years back, we had a room, it was probably about as long as this one, maybe a little bit shorter. And we asked someone, go to the end of the room, count the things on the table, come back and tell me what you counted. And they'd walk down and come back, and they said there were 8 pencils and 4 erasers and 9 pens or whatever there were. And they were right with about 97% accuracy. Now, personally, I would have expected 100%. It wasn't a really tough job. But 97, I'd settle for 97%. And then we did one thing different. We put a door in the middle of the room and we locked it, and we handed this person the key. We said, now walk up to that door, unlock it, go through, lock it behind you, go count, come back, unlock the door, lock it again, tell me what you counted. Throw out a number of what you think their accuracy dropped to. 67%. They lost 30 points of accuracy when we asked them to do one thing in the middle of their work stream. Why? Because the human brain doesn't multitask. It does one task until you put that task aside, pick up another task, and then we expect to come back to that first task without losing anything we had started. Back to the analogy of security analysts. If I hit a query over here and I hit run, and if it takes more than, I don't know, 15, 20 seconds, in my head, it could take 5 or 10 minutes. I better go get a cup of coffee or start another task over here and hope when I come back to it, I remember what I was doing. Every time we expect our SOC analysts to switch focus or context, they are guaranteed to lose efficacy. It's just a guarantee. So, single pane of glass was a great idea, and the more we can keep people's attention in one common area, one context, and bring the data to them, not make them go get the data elsewhere, they will be more effective, and AI can help us get there. So, ESG did a study a few years back that claimed that for most mid to large enterprises, they are suffering with the battle of 25 to 50 different tools by 10 or more security vendors. And if you look at most mature security organizations, they've got one vendor for WAF and another vendor for email gateway and something else for firewall, and then they've got an EDR vendor and a DLP vendor. I'm not saying that everything needs to be by one vendor. That's not the point here. But the integration of these vendors into a common architecture needs to be improved, and AI can help us get there in some ways. The other one is that the skill shortage is a real thing. So let's talk about that for a minute. We call it a labor shortage, but in fact, it's not a labor shortage, it's a skills shortage. There are plenty of bodies to hire, they're just not always the bodies we want. Gartner, about 2 years ago, said that if every student who's enrolled in university between then and the end of the year 2024, so that's a 2-year span, if every student enrolled in university went into cyber, there'd still be a gap. Because there's just not enough gray matter coming out of university to satisfy the demand in security operations. Now that said, my youngest son graduated top of his class. I have his resume with me. I can fill one headcount out there, but that's about it. I'm not going to fix the problem by pawning my son off to you. But that's the problem we're faced with, is finding and retaining the right people. So, at the end of the day, it's about quickly and effectively reducing signal to noise. Sorry, noise to signal, right? Everything we do should be leading toward an actionable result that's prescriptive and gets something done. That's the problem we have. If you think about the number of telemetry sources we have and the information we're collecting, we are talking about a huge amount of data. SentinelOne alone ingests right now 1.9 trillion events a day from our customers. Now that all gets put in front of some SOC analyst somewhere or our MDR team, but they're not looking at trillions of events, right? There's no possible way to do that. What we have to do is boil that down to something more manageable, but even millions of storylines. And a storyline is nothing more than a number of events stitched together in time series order because they're related in some way, either by the same PID or username or IP address or host domain. All of these things kind of go into how we stitch it together. But even millions is something that a SOC analyst can't do. We need to aim for a handful of actionable events. And the only way to get there is to have some engine that's processing that data down for us and distilling it into something that we can actually make use of. We're looking for the reduction of alert fatigue. It's a huge problem. But the most important one there is we need to minimize the dwell time. The longer we take to find the adversary, the longer they have to muck around in our environment. And that's not good for anybody. So let's take a test. Who can tell the difference between these images? There's a series of labradoodles and there's a series of fried chicken. So AI can do that with about 90% accuracy. I think the latest run of this, it's about 92%. So it's getting better and better and better. I have another one later that takes a little more time for the machines, but humans can get there if they're given enough time. So 90% accuracy, okay. Are you equally comfortable with 90% in this situation? Probably not. Or this one. Not me. I had back surgery a couple years ago. Certainly glad that it was an actual neurosurgeon sitting there and not a scalpel that's being controlled by a Da Vinci machine that could be AI assisted. No, that's not what I want when they're cutting my neck open. All right, so that's never going to fly. So there's a time and a place for machines. Where does AI fit? So first of all, never expect AI to be intuitive, ethical, or strategic. It can't do those things. It's regurgitating or summarizing contextual inputs in a large language model about things that have already been said or written in the past. It's not creating net new intelligence. It's simply summarizing what's already been said. So there's no way that you can train it ethics. There are some ways that you can train it explainability, which is an important characteristic of an AI that we'll talk about maybe if we have time, but never expect your AI to be ethical or strategic. Just cannot do it. And by the same nature, never expect humans to be able to do the job that AI was built for, and that's massive amount of data processing, summarization, and hypothesis testing. All of these things are simply going to require bigger math and a lot more data than a human can ever possibly think to analyze. And all of this is laid on top of the real world and this cognitive workload that has to bounce back and forth. When do I use the AI and when do I use the humans? Humans know business context. AI doesn't. You might be able to train it a little bit and say that these are my high-value targets and these are my clerical users, and there's a very big difference in the risk posture that I'm accepting from each of them. But it's never going to know things like who are my upstream providers and how do I understand what supply chain risks look like to me as a user. And if you outsource to a service provider, either an MDR or an MSSP, they don't have that context usually either. So we need humans who actually understand your business, understand your risk posture, and understand your risk appetite for you to make informed decisions. So let's talk about SOC for a minute. We talked about the data silos. This is a huge problem. In a SIM, we never ingested those large volume data sources because it was cost prohibitive to do so, right? And so we made bad decisions. We're like, I'd love to have that data, but it's really expensive for me to ingest it, and if I only need it once, how do I justify the cost? Then you talk about retention. We'll talk about retention in a minute. But typically, people have these multiple silos of data. EDR telemetry, very high volume, but high fidelity and actionable immediately. Third party, typically went into my SIM, and that's my firewall logs, my VPN logs, my email gateway logs, and that's where that lives for the most part. Cloud, about 1,000 times more volume than an endpoint. And again, it's mostly machine-to-machine data that's being generated. And the signal-to-noise ratio of cloud data is about 1 in 10,000. The signal-to-noise ratio of an EDR set of data is about 1 in 2. Right? So think about the fact that the volume is high, but the fidelity is also high, and the data is almost immediately actionable. In the middle, third-party data, SIM stuff, it ranges from like 1 to 10 to 1 to 1,000 signal-to-noise ratio. But the point is, pick the data sources. You shouldn't be required to pick the data sources based on cost of ingest or cost of compute. There should be a methodology that allows you to ingest it at scale and keep it. The same study that ESG did also decided or learned from its respondents that 2/3 of all of the people that responded said that if you keep your data in separate silos, you are guaranteed to miss detections. It's huge. 451 Research, Scott Crawford, also did a research study recently that claimed that 50% of all alerts go untriaged. That's a huge number, right? We should all be worried about that. The skills shortage we talked about earlier, I'm not going to cover that again, but 25% of the threats go untriaged. This is the old number. Scott's latest research is 50%. And then retention. How many of you are keeping data only as long as you have to for governance reasons, compliance? Most of us. In fact, security teams want to keep data as long as possible if you can afford it. Let's just put that out there. Because if you ever do need that data, you don't want to be told, sorry, PCI told me I need to keep it for 3 years, so I purged it at that very next day. We run this battle between compliance and security because from a compliance perspective, if I have the data and don't use it, I'm at fault. If you get rid of it after, let's say your retention is 180 days, if I get rid of it at 181 and an attack occurs, I have plausible deniability that says, nope, that was beyond the scope of what we could retain, so I'm not at fault. Sunburst was a really great example of where we all wish we had more than 15 months of retained data, because the gap between initial access and detonation or exfiltration of data was 15 months. And so when a SOC analyst came in and the CISO is standing at his desk saying, am I at risk? He had no way of knowing if he didn't have 15, 16, 17 months of data to go back in time and look at. So think about retention as it impacts your ability to do retrospective threat hunting. All right, let's talk real quick about a workflow of an attack. Initially, you collect a ton of data, and this could be from any number of vendors. I mentioned earlier 25 to 40 different tools by 12 different vendors. Every one of those products is generating telemetry. I like to say that I speak two languages. I speak English, and I speak regular expression, because that's the language you needed to do if you were going to do feature extraction from a syslog record. You'd take that thing and you'd chop it up with regex, and then you'd take that data and you'd apply it to the schema, and you'd get all the data in. Fraught with challenges, never really worked 100% of the time. I will say that's improved lately with mature logging facilities like XML and JSON, because they're name value pairs, which is super helpful to parse, easy to do feature extraction from a JSON record. But the next most important thing is how you store that data affects the way you can query it later. So the normalization and the taxonomy of the schema is also incredibly important. We've selected one that most of the vendor community has selected. It's called OCSF, stands for the Open Cybersecurity Schema Framework. That means that when data lands in that schema, any tool can look at it and know exactly what field we're looking for. Vendor A calls their field SIP, vendor B calls it source IP, vendor C calls it source_IP_adder, right? Those all get normalized, so any product looking at an OCSF database knows exactly where the source IP is. Whole lot easier when it's been normalized to that level of detail to have action. Then the triage occurs. I should have brightened up those lines a little bit, but basically all the lines are going to the right except for the bottom one. The triage is all about connecting the dots. Starting to do root cause analysis if you can, merging and then scoping. And scoping in the triage phase is all about going back to that original well of data and try to get more context. Or maybe go to a third-party source like a TI feed, a threat intelligence feed, or an ISAC and getting IOCs or TTPs. All of that is part of the triage phase. Then you prioritize, rank them accordingly. This is all about which one should I focus my attention on. If I've got 1,000 alerts in front of me, I better be focusing on ones that are affecting critical utility or critical assets, high-value targets, revenue-generating applications or service and hosts. Like, those are the types of things that are probably most important to your business, so you rank them accordingly. And then you scope. Which one do I handle? Can I build better visualizations like heat maps and trends and all that? And then I'm going to enrich that with more information that I go back to the well of data for. And then at some point, I get to respond, right? This is the far right. This is where we actually take action. This is where we're going to have positive impact on this behavior. I might quarantine, I might remediate, I might roll back, and then I'm going to update and improve my countermeasure policy to make sure that whatever my root cause analysis told me, I've prevented going forward, so I'm not going to be exposed to or impacted by that similar threat again. And then maybe I share that upstream back to an ISAC, parallel to others in your vertical. There's great information sharing sources now, back to vendor communities, or updating threat intelligence. Now, where can we align humans and where can we align automation and AI? We get huge benefits of automation on the left, and that is adding new data sources with products that have name value pair syslog or logging facilities. I can automate that pretty well now to where I can actually just dump data in. It automatically knows how to do feature extraction for these things and put it into the right format and into the right schema. AI does a really good job in the middle of performing advanced triage, prioritization, and scoping, because I feed it information that it allows, that it can use to leverage the threat intelligence, the business context, my prioritization scheme, my risk posture, my risk appetite. All of that can help us in that area. As well up top, it can actually do the things like quarantining and remediating and things like that. That can be automated through playbooking or workflows or things like that. In fact, we did a study that we gave our SOC analysts a new tool, a new AI-guided tool. So think about a SOC analyst that would prefer to do things in natural language. A SOC analyst coming out of university right now, getting his first job, a student coming out, he didn't do his thesis by going to the public library and taking down a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas, right? We did, but they didn't. They learned to research through prompt engineering, the new term, prompt engineering. What does that mean? It means asking Google stuff, right? It's how do I ask the right question to get the answer I want? Now, who knows what RAG stands for? It's Response Augmented Generative AI. And all that means is the first question I ask starts the flow of things. The second question I ask is additive to the first one. It remembers what the first question was and says, I'm not starting from scratch. I'm adding to that question another set of criteria or parameters that's going to help me narrow down the set of data to an actionable data set. That is RAG, Response Augmented Generative AI. So we gave this tool to SOC analysts, and they came back with 3 statistics. First one is they could do their job 80% faster. That's good, right? We can get more productivity out of our people. Does that mean you can get rid of 4/5 of your SOC analysts? No, because there's probably a backlog of things. But what we can do now is start allowing your tier 1 analysts to do more fun things, I'll call it fun, more helpful things, a little more threat hunting, and a lot less log jockeying, right? We can allow them to up-level their skill set, and because the prompt engineering provides analysis and response back that guides them for the next questions they should ask, it's actually teaching them to be better SOC analysts. Maybe they don't know where to start. So maybe there's a quick start that says, let's look for UNC 1878. That's the Ryuk ransomware family. So we have a quick start button that says, start there. And if you start there, it builds a query that's about 8 pages long of all of the TTPs and IOCs, the atomic indicators of Ryuk. And so they don't have to go and research who Ryuk is, download the list of TTPs, build the query in this complex structure, hope they don't do any typos or copy-paste errors, and then they're going to learn, okay, this is what Ryuk looks like. And the next question is, if it does come back with results, how do I narrow that down even further? How do I get more detailed information? So they said 80% faster at their jobs, 128% easier, and the one that I didn't put up here because marketing doesn't want me to say it, 90% more fun. Now, that's probably not a metric you want to raise to your board, but we all know that if you can keep your employees enjoying their job a little more, retention's a whole lot easier, maybe even attraction of new talent will be if you can show them that you're using these kind of tools. Human intellect, though, is still required in a number of these things, right? It could be scattered out throughout this, like you had to have humans that train the AI about your business context and your risk posture. Those things have preemptive assessments that are done by humans. The update and improve, it's not going to automatically go and change your firewall policies for you, but it's going to be prescriptive enough and tell you here's what should be done, and then it will probably still require something. Now, over time, that will be automated as well. But again, that just simply frees up the human to go do more intellectually challenging things, and we'll see more of that going forward. So we have this philosophy at SentinelOne, and it's not just unique to us. These are the things that AI should do for you. Most importantly is the top left. We need to shift the model. We need to create an imbalance of work between what an adversary has to do to attack us and what us as defenders have to do to stop him. As long as we can keep that in our favor, weighted in our favor, we will stay ahead of the game. How far ahead of the game is questionable. It's kind of a leapfrog right now. Everyone's bumping up their skill set. While we have the OpenAI models and Geminis and others, they've got HackGPT and FraudGPT, and these are tools that have been built and trained on LLMs that the good guys are not using, and there are no guardrails on it, so it's very easy to ask questions like, I want a piece of malware that targets Windows 10 H2 and does a shadow driver bypass, and it will generate code for you that will do it. It's pretty scary. So that's the most important one, in my opinion, is creating this work imbalance. But the goal of all of us on the bottom right is we need to drive down cost and time associated with both detecting and remediating or containing these types of threats. The middle ones are also important. Reduction of the number of tools, that goes back to the context shifting. We need to keep our users focused in one area, not expect them to shift back and forth. We need to improve the velocity and accuracy of the triage and investigation. That's true too. The natural language interface, it should be conversational. It shouldn't be you learn a new tool, and we're expecting our practitioners to become experts in 8 different products or query languages. And it should have access to or visibility to multiple data sources of telemetry, not just from a single vendor, but think about this as the Minority Report. Think about this as the detective that does have access to all that information he needs when there's a dead body laying there. We need to at least have the data that's federated and accessible. We believe, as an industry, we should democratize the data that you're generating and collecting. No one application should hold it hostage. OCSF helps with that, by the way, because of the common format. Great. So, the whole is truly better than the sum of its parts. We know that there's a need for AI to do the complex data analysis that we can't expect human intellectual capital to do, but the human intellectual capital still helps us to train it, as well as it takes our existing SOC analysts and allows them to up-level their skill set so they become better SOC analysts. Now, that also means they might be more marketable SOC analysts. So don't think that it's going to keep them there. It could make them incredibly happy with what they're doing, and they might be willing to stay a little longer, but you're also teaching them skills that are very marketable. So you actually could be carving out other resources that you'll need to replace later. But the idea is the whole is definitely better than some of its parts. So 90% accurate with fried chicken or labradoodles. This is a slightly harder one. Chocolate chip ice cream or Dalmatians. This one takes a little bit longer, but every human I know will get it right 100% of the time if you give them enough time. AI is about 82% of that one, by the way. Okay. Any questions? Any answers?
Answer's good.
Great. Anybody who would like a copy of this presentation, happy to share a PDF version of it. Either talk to me, or do you know if these are being distributed after the event?
They should be, yeah.
Great, so you'll get a copy.
This is also being recorded, and I think the recording is being distributed as well.
Fantastic. All right. Yes, question in the back. So the question is, I mentioned Fraud GPT and Fraud GPT and Hack GPT. How many of these are out there? How many do we know about? About 6. How many are working? About 4. How many does the NSA track? More. We do know that they're out there. It's also incredibly easy to stand up a new one. I don't know if you guys remember LimeWire or Napster, and when one site went down, another one popped up, and you could still find the seeds somewhere out there. Attackers are using the same techniques, not to mention the fact that these are being hosted as a service. And as a service means I can flip it off of Cloudflare and over to somebody else very quickly, and my data is still there, and I've trained the LLM already. Continually training the data set is the hard part for them, but they're getting really good at it. And they're getting cooperative to a point that we've never seen before. So it is still a business, though, for ransomware and malicious actors. Like, everyone wants to make money, so they may not share all their secrets, but they are definitely pumping a lot of code up there. The last malware analysis that was done was clearly generated by AI because it left the comments in the code itself. Like, this is what this line does, and here's where we're attacking the driver code. Like, you don't describe it like that when you actually write malicious code, but they actually generated code with AI and didn't strip out the comments, so we kind of know what happened. The other thing is, adversaries are using false flag data, so they'll actually take snippets of code from one threat actor and embed it in theirs so that we think it's that guy, when in fact it's this guy that just changed the code a little bit or decided to use a fragment of his. So there are more that are popping up. I will tell you that the intelligence community is aware of most of them as soon as they pop up. So 75 seconds was the time between launching a new cloud instance or a tenant and getting it scanned. I would say that some 3-letter agencies are about 90 seconds away from finding new systems like that when they get launched, if we're lucky. Any other questions? I hope it was helpful. Thank you really so much for your time. And if you have any questions, please approach me after. Happy to answer them.